is it just me, or is natural selection kind of blind when it comes to evolution?
Natural selection is blind to everything by definition. Haven't you read The Blind Watchmaker? Natural selection is not a being, it's a process, a pattern of population genetics emerging from the bottom up rather than an order commanded from the top down, which is why creationists are unable to understand it. It's like the mindset of thinking that there must be a tiny band of musicians living inside the radio. As some believers have to imagine that everything happens not because of mere cause and effect, but because an invisible, imperceptible, intelligent agent told that thing to happen. That's how the Bible and the Quran both describe how and why everything happens, because God either ordered it to happen or gave it permission to happen. Thus, scriptural literalists can never believe that anything happens otherwise, not even the sunrise. They don't even allow that maybe what we perceive as a sunrise is only because we're on a spinning globe, such that we could only see the sun on half of that rotation, and it would still be that way whether there was a God or not. No. Some religious extremists would rather say that the sun orbits the earth and that the earth is flat, or that reality itself isn't even real, rather than consider that maybe it's their God that isn't real.
John! Where is he?
He's in the bedroom.
Let's see here.
He's tossing off to magazines in the bathroom.
Ooh. Messing with my privacy. Huh?
Ow!
John? Are you okay?
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Are you sure you're okay?
Can masturbating make you go blind? 100%.
Yeah, no, I just got back from the eye doctors. They dilated my pupils. Getting here was a little dicey, but I'm starting to see a lot better now.
Then why are you talking to a coat rack?
I thought you were looking a little taller.
You can go blind from masturbating. It's just a matter of when and how.
I was gonna get your help deciding on what swatches to pick out, but I think this is a really bad time.
Because you just went blind from masturbating.
No, I can do it. Give me a try.
Okay, well, I started out by liking this one. Yeah, this one. But then I figure I'd tune it back a bit. Yeah, what do you think?
I like this one. Yeah.
No. I think we're gonna work on this a little later.
Whatever.
We better get to studying.
What are we studying today?
Natural selection. I've already started reading it. There's a great definition in our biology textbook. So, natural selection is the process by which organisms with variation most suited to their local environment survive and leave more offspring.
So, evolutionary theory holds that natural selection is one of the forces that drives evolution.
How's that work?
Well, evolutionists say a mutation happens in the sex cells of a creature and its offspring exhibits the resulting trait difference, like a new feather color or something. The trait can give it an advantage or a disadvantage. A beneficial mutation would cause it to become a little better at surviving in an environment than the non-mutants. So, its descendants, and thus the trait, eventually outnumber the others. Then the scenario repeats with another variation, supposedly driving evolution forward.
Close, but not quite. First of all, everyone is a mutant. Humans have an average of 128 mutations per zygote right from the moment of conception, and those are just the ones that we start out with. And evolution moves forward only in the sense that time marches on. Thus, forward is the only direction that anything that still exists can go. And a new variety doesn't need to outnumber the others either. It's just a new population, an increasing number of new varieties, biodiversity, which is what evolution is all about.
But rather than this process producing just the varieties we see among animal kinds, they believe this process built those animals from completely different ones and can eventually lead to one kind of animal turning into another. But this has never been observed.
Because that is not at all what evolution teaches. First of all, there's no such thing as a kind. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the next episode. Actually, the next 2 or 3 episodes at least. For the moment, suffice it to say that there has never been any time in evolutionary history where one kind of thing ever gave birth to or turned into another fundamentally different kind than its ancestors were. It seems I have to repeat that in every episode of the series because it is the creationists' favorite strawman fallacy.
Fish are still fish, and finches are still finches.
Neither group constitutes either a species or a kind. Finches are a clade of several hundred species of passerine birds, themselves a subset of a larger clade indistinguishable from other avian clades that are all genetically related. While the word fish is taxonomically undefined, so we use the term chordate instead.
And here in the biology textbook, they point out that the polar bear had the advantage as a predator in the snow because of its white coat. And it also shows that if you start with yellow and green grasshoppers, two different traits inherited from the parents, the green may outnumber the yellow in a green environment because they are harder for birds to see and catch.
So, did the grasshoppers think through how other animals would avoid it if it looked more camouflage? Did it know how to genetically engineer itself to express those colors? Did a polar bear engineer its own white coat?
You're so stupid.
No, but that's not what evolutionists believe. They think that these changes happen randomly in the DNA, influencing an individual's survivability. Evolution is a blind process, no offense. Intelligent choices supposedly have nothing to do with it.
If intelligent choices are required for something to exist, then how do John and Jane explain the script they're reading from? Including the fact that that script contradicts the one they read from in the previous episode.
So adaptation is real?
Yeah, I saw an explanation of it in the Focus on Earth Science. Individuals with characteristics that are poorly suited to the environment are less likely to survive and reproduce.
Over time, poorly suited characteristics may disappear from the species.
See, then they accepted natural selection entirely, as long as they called it adaptation instead. But this week, they have to pretend as if they've never understood what they previously said they got and were okay with.
Evolutionists believe natural selection figured out how to design an eye. But how? It would have to build and preserve over who knows how many generations, hundreds of complicated interacting eye parts, including proteins that were all useless until the whole package was eventually assembled.
Does John think that there were parts and proteins already lying around before eyes were developed? Of course not. He's just trying to misrepresent the evolution of the eye as much as he can. And we'll cover that more in an upcoming episode too. I don't want to repeat myself too much in this series.
How did it know to engineer animals for flight?
If an animal is small enough, light enough, that it can use the folding covers of its carapace to get lift in the air and thus escape predators, that animal would have a powerful selective pressure to keep doing that and to get better at it, with better flyers dominating over those who don't do it so well. The same goes for any animal that can use whatever means it has to tread the air with sufficient lift to compensate its own weight, until we have a vast variety of different varieties of flying animals, literally without a thought from any of them, nor from the inevitable result of population mechanics that we call natural selection.
Or a navigation system so tiny it can fit in the head of a monarch butterfly, which is smaller than a pin.
A pattern of replicating molecules will be tiny and vastly more complex than the boxy analog units built by human hands that John seems to be imagining.
How'd it wire a human brain that's far more complicated than our best computers if it is a totally blind process with no goal or purpose in view?
Again, a pattern of replicating molecules will be vastly more complex than anything humans build using wires. Your brain doesn't have wires. It's a cellular organism, starting with nerves, and then a knot of nerves, and a sufficiently large nerve knot is called a brain. And your brain is a neural network of 86 billion neurons, with each neuron connecting to thousands of others. And what you know, what you learn, and what you practice and rehearse builds these neural pathways in your brain, just like working out in the gym, such that it would not be possible to take you out of your body and put you into somebody else's body, because your brain is not a computer and your mind is not software that can be swapped and shared. You are not only inextricably integrated into that hardware, you are that configuration of hardware.
You're right. Natural selection is just a process. It doesn't have a brain. It can't think or design. It had no foreknowledge of what it was trying to accomplish.
Because it's not trying to accomplish anything. It's not a being with a will. It's not an intentional designer, but an incidental algorithm that has the effect of producing, testing, and refining and improving designs, all literally without a thought or purpose or goal. It's just an inevitable effect that we've given a name, while John and Jane want to give it an identity, too, to anthropomorphize it into some sort of deity.
And yet, coupled with mutations, it's been assigned godlike powers to create things way beyond man's understanding.
Yes! It's like they've replaced God's power with random mutations and natural selection.
We can't replace what was evidently never there to begin with. But we have identified a system that really is there, and that really can devise designs beyond the capacity of human designers. But it's a process, not a person. Religious fundamentalists want to imagine agency in everything, pretending that there's an invisible man in the sky telling everything to be however it is or to do whatever it does. But believers have everything turned upside down, as I explained in my video on the 7th foundational falsehood of creationism.
Evolution does depend on mutations, and these do appear to be random. But each cumulative mutation may become significant factors for that organism once pitted against the dynamics of the environment in which they are introduced. Thus, natural selection isn't random, it's deterministic. Many creationists will even admit this, and as some computer models have already shown, natural selection can actually even exceed the skills of human designers. In fact, natural selection can be so deterministic that it often leads to innovations which some perceive as evidence of intelligent design and which even rationalists describe as though modified for intended benefit. Whether it is deliberately guided or not, there is definitely a system of design, but there doesn't actually have to be any apparent intent or intelligence involved. Because while our normal intuition might be to imagine one governing body issuing authority from the top down, a new field of science, the study of emergent complexity, uses computers to trace numerous patterns in nature which are all emergent, from the bottom up, being controlled or constructed by an intricate interrelated array of the lowest components working together in unison, each according to a set of relatively simple rules.
Based in a world that is built on rules.
Emergence is a new study revealing many ways in which order can come from disorder and how chaos can also achieve balance, illustrating how even the origin of life is as much chemical as it is mathematic.
As the textbook points out, it favors a creature's overall ability to survive, but the actual changes are happening deep down in the creature on a microscopic level inside the genes.
Wait. So you're saying that when certain individuals die, all their genes just go away? Meaning that natural selection has no power in selecting individual genes?
It's not a power. It's just that evolution, being a blind and incidental, unintentional process, has the appearance of experimenting in every direction at once. Because with a system of continuous replication, if that replication is even slightly imperfect, if occasional errors ever could happen at all, and they can happen anywhere in the system, then variety is eventually inevitable and cumulative, but not always in a given direction because it's not directed. And sometimes one variety might become a little bit more complex while something else becomes less so, because there is no goal except on the part of individual organisms in the struggle to survive and thrive. And it is there that natural and sexual selection have an effect on population mechanics, in that the more successful individuals eventually proliferate while other variants may be weeded out, each by their individual fortunes, which we only see reflected generations later.
Well, it can't see genes, just whole organisms. Kind of like me trying to help you pick out swatches that I can't even see.
But it looks like you're doing better now.
I am. So how about this one?
Or maybe not.
Also, natural selection is supposed to mean survival of the fittest. But what if someone, nobody in particular, had their eyes dilated and was leaving when they knocked over the fish tank in the waiting room?
You didn't.
Anyway, if exactly half of them died because they didn't get them in the water, was it survival of the fittest?
No, it was survival of the luckiest.
Creationists have a problem comprehending any of this because it's all big picture situations happening on the scale of whole populations over many generations, where one original group eventually diversifies into two or more recognizably distinct varieties, unbeknownst even to them, becoming new modifications of the old ancestral set, where believers can only imagine a single individual in one generation suddenly making the conscious decision to turn into or give birth to
something completely different.
How can they distort all of this so badly all of the time? It's not always because they're stupid. but it is because they're afraid to understand what they're terrified to believe. So they misrepresent it, not just to lie to other people, but to keep themselves confused, which is even more important in the mind of the faithful.
Yeah, well, here's a picture of two mutant flies and a normal one. Which one do you think is the most likely to survive in a particular environment?
None of them, when I hit him with my fly swatter.
Scientists have experimented with fruit flies not just to see what mutations are and how they work and all of that, but to find out how Hox genes work and so on. And most of what we know about genetics comes from experiments with fruit flies. And creationists always show the defects that were never intended to be improvements, and they ignore the fact that we actually have noted improvements too, like this study of rapid increase in viability due to new beneficial mutations in fruit flies. Creationists don't talk about that because it doesn't fit their narrative, and because they're still fruit flies. They didn't turn into palm trees or jet airplanes or whatever the wanna-believers want to imagine.
All right, the normal one would probably survive best, but it depends on the environment, right?
Yeah, so evolution that turns a simpler organism into a fruit fly relies on mutants becoming better able to survive as new genetic information is added, and then surviving to pass their genes onward.
I wonder what John means by a simpler organism. What we call fruit flies are any of some 4,000 species of common fruit flies in the family Drosophilidae, as well as another 5,000 species of true fruit flies in the family Trophetidae, and both in different subdivided subsets of the order Diptera, which is a clade of about 1 million species that includes pretty much all forms of what we usually think of as flies. But I don't know of any group of living flies or their ancestors that anyone could say are simpler than any other species. Scientists don't talk like that. Only creationists use such undefined and undeterminable terms, usually when they're misrepresenting evolution into another strawman parody, which is the only thing believers know how to argue against.
Mutants are usually worse off since most mutations are harmful, and natural selection actually cleanses the population by killing the less fit mutants. This might help keep the most effective traits within a population.
So the real world works exactly opposite of what evolution requires.
Bingo!
No, creationism teaches exactly the opposite of what reality is and shows. Evolution works exactly the way John just described, except that the vast majority of mutations are actually neutral. The trivial minority of mutations that have any impact on survival or reproduction and therefore have selective pressures applied to them are nearly equal between whether there is a detriment or benefit. And while it is true that every individual in every generation is born with some number of mutations, this is not an example of mutation. This is an example of conjoined twins, where one has absorbed the other during development in the womb. So you might blame God for this.
Hello, Parker.
Miss Wedgwood?
You've met my cousin, Mr. Darwin, before.
Sir?
He's fast, eh?
Fastest in the county.
You breed him yourself?
I mated him with a bitch who was pretty swift.
And how would you breed a fellow like Squib here?
From the runts, I suppose.
How dare you? Squib is quite as nice as any of your rotten dogs.
It's true. It's from the runts and monsters that breeders can produce tailless cats. Or pygmies, like Squib.
I'm not listening to any more of this. Take me back to the house at once and stop saying horrid things.
From wolves to greyhounds. From bulldogs to fellows like Squib. In what? A matter of a few hundred years. I take it you don't find talk of dogs all that interesting.
I can think of more interesting topics of conversation.
Such as?
The novels of Miss Austen.
And what does she have to say about selective breeding?
Nothing, as I recall.
Ah, that's a great pity. Why shouldn't nature produce such differences? These different breeds of dog.
Why should it? What would be the point?
Survival.
In nature, a little poppet like Squib, who was the smallest in her litter, would die. You nearly did die, didn't you?
Yes, that's true, but what about the one with a little more vigor? Or a head start? Because of some peculiarity?
Such as?
A puppy, born with an extra thick coat in a hot climate, would be a monstrosity. But in a cold climate, that would be a good adaptation. That puppy would have an advantage.
And while lots of small mutations can give a survival advantage in specific environments, virtually all the real-life examples show a loss of genetic information, not a gain.
This is another lie in the form of misdefined, misleading misinformation, because creationists typically refuse to define information in any way that could allow us to determine whether information is gained or lost. They won't provide any explanation of what they think that means because they know that the moment they do, we will immediately present exactly the evidence that they say has never been observed. Although I have seen some of the more simple-minded creationists say that the deletion of a gene, or the fusion of 2 chromosomes into 1, counts as a loss of information. But they don't usually recognize that by that logic, duplication mutations would have to count as a gain. Except that John here isn't as smart as even the more dim-witted creationists, and he's about to prove that.
Evolutionists have tried to propose various genetic explanations, like gene duplication, but they're putting their faith in a process that has never actually been observed.
What's gene duplication?
It's when a whole gene accidentally gets copied and then it mutates to become another new gene.
Nice story. Have scientists ever seen that happen?
Nope, never.
Of course we have. Just look at this article on the fundamentals of molecular evolution, which says that neofunctionalization involves acquiring new function by the duplicated gene at the expense of the ancestral function. That is, that the duplicated gene acquires a function that was not present in the ancestral gene. And they give an example of something that is actually observed. The type 3 antifreeze protein gene in Antarctic zooarcid fish evolved from a sialic acid synthase gene after duplication, divergence, and neofunctionalization. The sialic acid synthase is an old cytoplasmic enzyme present in microbes through vertebrates, whereas AFP3s are secreted plasma proteins that bind to invading ice crystals and arrest ice growth to prevent fish from freezing. So this is an example of a duplication mutation enabling Antarctic fish to pump antifreeze through their circulatory system, a useful adaptation for these fish who lived in the coldest of marine environments. Now, John doesn't know about any of that because he's just a dumb kid reading from a deliberately deceptive script written as propaganda. And the scriptwriters in this case don't know about that either because they don't like learning things that contradict their collective assumptions.
And most examples of supposed evolution in action involve things like chemical pathways and small changes in proteins.
You know, things that qualify as evolution, changing allele frequencies and reproductive populations over successive generations. Evolution by definition, as opposed to the straw man parody that creationists made up to knock down while they're trying to move the goalposts, to criticize something else, a straw man parody of what evolution never was.
Well, the vice governor of the Galapagos told me he could identify which island a tortoise came from by its markings.
Yes. Small variations are possible from island to island. Adaptations to climate and so on.
Yes, but the islands all have the same climate. My expert, John Gould, tells me he's found different species of finches. What if these finches were blown to the Galapagos from South America and then began to change, adapt, if you will, become more and more different from their ancestors generation after generation? First into varieties, then into new species. Each new species marooned on its own island.
What are you talking about? What if the finches were blown to the Galapagos? God put those creatures there.
That makes no sense. Why would God put different birds on almost identical islands?
I have no idea. It's not a question that requires an answer. Species were commanded into existence by God. They're perfect forms, and they've been perfect since the day of creation. It's divine law, God's will.
But how do you get a fin to turn into a limb and then a human hand?
Small changes over ages and ages can throw up mountain ranges and sink continents. If mountains can move and rivers can move, then why can't animals?
They tell interesting stories about how it must have just happened. But I can't find any evidence it actually happened.
He can't find any evidence because he won't look at what he doesn't want to see. He pretends that evolution is just a story because his own position is literally just a story and nothing more. I present substantial evidence for the transition, the evolution from fins to limbs to the human hand amid myriad intermediate stages in episodes 9 through 46 on my series on the systematic classification of life. I've tried to show that to people making the script for John and Jane, But the folks at Genesis Apologetics refuse to engage with science-minded people because they want to pretend that the evidence isn't there, even when they know it is. Because it's all about make-believe, and they don't want reality to harsh their buzz.
So, a typical mutation removes information, but only a mutation that can add information really explain how philosophers came from fish.
By definition, any change in information becomes new information.
And if you think about it, natural selection can't create anything. It can only deselect by killing whole individuals with traits that are already present in a population.
Wow, you're right.
No, the traits in question were not already in the population. They came from mutations. But John doesn't want to admit that fact. Instead, he wants to talk about killing whole individuals, as if we could kill a partial individual. And we're not talking about individuals anyway, but whole species. And when a species goes extinct, it's not because it was deselected.
Nature selected them for extinction.
You can only select something that is already present. How could nature ever add information to some DNA by subtracting some of what is already there?
Great question.
Because mutations do not subtract from what is already there. If they did, then the majority of the human genome wouldn't have so many defective pseudogenes. No, mutations add information to DNA, and that can mean adding a considerable length to DNA also, producing novel traits. We have several specific examples of de novo genes, new functional beneficial genes occurring through mutations that have the ability to form new structures and systems, and then later different lineages may develop them in new and different ways according to newer mutations accrued on top of that. That is the creative aspect of evolution. But John and Jane don't want to admit that fact. They're not allowed to, because they think that
natural selection is an ingenious theory for denying the working and therefore the existence of the Creator.
And speaking of information, here's another question evolutionists have not even come close to answering. How could chemicals from early Earth spontaneously form molecules with information?
Because they don't inherently have information, at least not the way John is thinking about. If John can't comprehend natural selection, which, let's face it, that's 19th century science, then how is he going to understand the really complicated origin of life studies in biochemistry, some of which is still being worked out today? Baby steps, John. Figure out the basics first before moving on to the hard stuff.
That's a stretch. So, natural selection can't do anything without mutations, and mutations can't even happen unless DNA forms from some muddy puddle billions of years ago.
You got it.
Thank you, John and Jane, for logically disproving your own belief in young Earth creationism. You already admitted that
most mutations are harmful, and natural selection actually cleanses the population by killing the less fit mutants.
And now you say that
and mutations can't even happen unless DNA forms from some muddy puddle billions of years ago.
You got it.
And since you've already admitted that mutations do happen, then by your own logic, evolution is true and young Earth creationism is wrong. You guys don't know how to logic very well, do you?
There's no known mechanism for creating information like we find in DNA from simple matter. Information always comes from a mind.
Standard definitions of information, even the definition of genetic information, does not apply to what John is referring to as the information within DNA, which is only called that in the sense that it determines the development of an organism. But that type of information does not and cannot come from a mind. We know what it does come from, but again, John will not admit that fact, even though it is a fact that can be verified.
And God is the mind behind creating the DNA in the first place.
Yeah.
Except that there evidently is no God, and you shouldn't assert baseless speculation as if it was a matter of fact. It's hard for some of us to believe that the genius behind DNA is also the idiot responsible for the Bible.
But the biggest problem I have with natural selection being able to create new kinds of animals is found right here in our biology textbook. Let me see if I can find it.
You're starting to see really well.
I am. Now, Charles Darwin is credited for discovering natural selection and describing how it led to the evolution of different animals and plants. Right here it tells the story. After reading Malthus, Darwin realized that if more individuals are reproduced than can survive. Members of a population must compete to obtain food, living space, and other limited necessities of life. Darwin described this as the struggle for existence.
Malthus? Oh, I remember him from history. He believed much of the world's problems were due to people reproducing faster than our food supply.
Whenever I can't sleep, I reach for Malthus. Or as I prefer to think of him, the Reverend T.R. Morpheus. Still warm. 2 brandies.
Yes, sir. The natural tendency of mankind is to reproduce. Humans can double their numbers every 25 years.
But they don't. A struggle for resources slows growth, and death and disease, war and famine check the population. I know the argument.
Yes, but don't you see exactly the same struggle takes place throughout nature? I don't know why I didn't make the connection before. Why are we not overrun with insects and frogs? Well, given the rate at which they reproduce, the number of eggs produced by each and every female.
Nature's broom sweeps away the ugly ducklings, the runts.
Yes, but it's not that simple. It's not that simple. Sometimes it's the ugly ducklings that are better adapted to the situations of life. They have longer legs and can run faster. They have bigger beaks that can crack harder nuts and seeds in harsh winters. They survive, have more offspring. Nature selects them to pass on their traits to future generations.
And where do we fit in?
Well, the sun does not revolve around the earth. Nature does not revolve around man. Man must fall into nature's cauldron. He's no deity, no exception. Once you accept that species can pass into one another, the whole fabric totters and falls.
They'll burn you at the stake for this.
Yes.
But now you have a theory.
Right. Evolution claims that a never-ending chain of struggle and death is what created life.
No one thinks that death created life. That's stupid.
But the Bible paints a different picture.
I think that if you study any aspect of science deeply enough, then if you study the Bible deeply too and compare them, you'll find that the Bible always paints a different picture than whatever we know to be true.
Genesis 3 says that death, pain, and suffering came from man's rebellion against God. And Romans 8 is clear that earth is under a curse because of our sin.
No, neither passage says those things. In fact, Genesis 3 says otherwise, because Adam was given a choice between 2 obviously metaphorical trees, that he could either acquire knowledge and be like unto the gods, or he could eat of the fruit of the tree of eternal life. And if he did that, then he would live forever. But he wasn't going to live forever anyway. He was already mortal. Death was already in the world because God made Adam as an animal that had to eat, to ingest and digest living cells in order to survive. And God had to get Adam out of the garden after he ate from the wrong tree, lest he eat from the tree of immortality too. And obviously this is all just a fable with a moral, warped though that so-called moral is.
But God didn't leave it there. 1 Corinthians 15 says that one day death will be conquered. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So death is a horrible thing. The Bible calls death the punishment for our sins and the last enemy. Because Jesus Christ took that penalty in our place, we beat death by getting to spend an eternity with God. Evolutionary history says death of the unfit over eons changed fish into humans. But biblical history says that death changed already created humans and fish and the whole universe into a place with problems that Jesus will one day solve.
So John doesn't understand science or theology. As amusing as a theological debate between John and I would be, I'm just not into fables and folklore, and I would rather stick to reality, what we can show to be true, that we don't need faith to believe.
Wow, it seems so strange that the things our textbook says could have so much to do with what we believe about the past and about reality.
Okay, speaking of beliefs, how would you define religion?
I know this from class. It's basically defined as a system of beliefs.
Right, so would evolution qualify as a religion?
Well, okay, the struggle for survival over millions of years of death is what supposedly created the different kinds of life on Earth, including humans.
Whoops, no, I'm sorry.
Jane couldn't answer the question, so I will. Every position or practice that is commonly accepted as a religion by both its adherents and its critics is a doctrine of ritual traditions, ceremonies, mythology, and the associated dogma of faith-based belief systems that all include the idea that a supernatural essence of self, be it a soul or consciousness, memories, etc., may in some way transcend the death of the physical body to continue on in some other form. This applies to every religion and only to religion, but it doesn't apply to evolution or atheism either. And here John is yet again attempting the tu quoque fallacy, that you're just as bad as I am. And notice how earlier he said that
But they're putting their faith in a process that has never actually been observed.
that's just more projection, the fallacy of false equivalence, as if science is a faith-based belief system, as if creationists have ever seen animals being created out of thin air, as if religion ever had any actual factual evidence the way evolution demonstrably does. The textbooks are teaching what we know, and more importantly, how we know it. It's based on objectively verifiable evidence, and it's subject to revision as our understanding improves. So it's not a belief system like religion is. You're not required to believe what you're taught, and you would be celebrated if you could correct or improve any of it. But creationism is just a wholesale denial of reality to instead make believe in a fable that we know is not really true. That's honestly all it is.
The Bible tells us death is an enemy, not the hero. But Jesus, the Creator, promises us life if we choose to follow Him. He has overcome death by rising from the grave.
You know what I think is happening? You're all nervous.
Even in Trinitarian Christianity, Jesus is not the Creator. That's His Father, Jehovah. Jane, like John, doesn't even understand her own religion, much less science. Death is not the hero in evolution, nor is it even required for natural selection in a theory of biodiversity for the struggle for life. But notice how she anthropomorphizes death as if it's a person. That's what she's trying to do with natural selection, too.
So, natural selection has no intelligence and can't even select what's happening on the genetic level. It can only subtract from what is already present in DNA, and it relies on death to create new kinds of life.
You know what? I've decided that you people, you're not nervous at all. You're just not bright. And that is okay.
I'm really starting to see that natural selection really doesn't have the power that evolution needs, to turn fish into apes and then people.
There are hundreds of millions of years and many intermediate species between apes and what you would call fish. But why would John and Jane know that when they don't know anything else? When they don't even know what their own position is?
Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
If only there was some way to make dogmatic believers like John and Jane and their scriptwriters think.